So I would like to continue the presentation as to the presentation, and then I would like to ask the Professor Mitani to comment to both your presentation, and then after that, I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions. I want to take time for that. And next, I would like to ask Guillaume Ducoeur to his presentation. The title is The Prototype of the Ancient Rushi and Constructed Figure of the Buddha in Dhyāna. So, Professor Ducoeur, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I would like to thank Professor Dake and Professor EY very warmly for organizing this lecture. I would also like to thank all those who took the time to come and listen to us. I would also like to apologize for not being able to present this lecture in Japanese. Thank you for being so accommodating and for warm welcome. So, in his 13 notes sur les 4 degrés du dhyāna, published in the Lotus de la Bonne Loi in 1852, Eugène Burnouf, who was certainly the first European to attempt to describe these 4 degrees in detail, had already questioned the original meaning of the term dhyāna as well as its translation into French. I quote, "I have long hesitated, I confess, between the words meditation and contemplation to translate the term dhyāna. The word contemplation has this advantage in my eyes that it reserves that of meditation for samadhi. I have kept the word contemplation until further notice because it seems to me to be more extensive than the word meditation, and since the idea of ecstatic happiness is included under the 3rd degrees of dhyāna, it seems to me that the notion of contemplation is more in keeping with this very idea." Burnouf's argument is based on 2 main criteria. The first involves simply using the default term, i.e., reserving the term meditation for translating the Buddhist term samadhi. The second, resulting from the close reading of the text, brings the ecstatic state of bliss, sukha, resulting from the first 2 degrees of dhyāna closer to the very idea of contemplation according to its meaning in Western religious traditions. To understand Burnouf's choice to use the French term contemplation, we need to consider its Latin meaning. The French term contemplation appears in Christian literature from the 12th century onwards and is based on the Latin word contemplatio, in the sense of looking through the eyes of the mind, contemplare. According, for example, to Cicero's invitation to Caesar in his defense of the king Deiotarus, I quote, "Propone tibi duos reges, et id animo contemplare quod oculis non potet." Represent to yourselves the 2 kings and look into your thoughts as a spectacle which you cannot see with your eyes. In fact, the successors of Burnouf in the discipline he founded, namely European Buddhology, proposed other translations, sometimes greatly expanding the semantic field of the term dhyāna and thereby reducing the possible understanding of such a concept, which itself comes from a long internal Buddhist tradition, both Theravada and Mahāsangika, as well as Mahayana, or even later Tantrayana. In his Sanskrit Wörterbuch in 1883, Otto Böttling proposed the German term Nachsinnen, Vertiefung, and more particularly in the religious field, Betrachtung and Beschauung, to translate the word dhyāna. Whereas Hermann Oldenberg translated the term dhyāna in his work on the Buddha as Versenkung, and quote, this Buddhist practice ecstasy, reflecting a long mystical tradition in both Western and Asian religious life. At the same time, at the Orientalist Institute of the University of Louvain, Louis de la Vallée-Poussin translated the 4 degrees of dhyāna as the 4 ecstasies, and was followed in this by his disciple Étienne Lamotte in his Histoire du bouddhisme indien, published in 1976. Jan Bonda's 1963 survey in the various European translations of the term dhyāna clearly attests to the difficulties Indianists encountered in rendering this notion into a language other than Sanskrit or Prakrit, a notion which is so important not just in the area of Buddhist doctrine, but also in the traditional biography of the Buddha. This difficulty is further compounded by the fact that the history of Sanskrit literature, and particularly that the Vedic, provides no occurrence of the term and offers little opportunity to recontextualize the Buddhist notion contrasted with the same technical term, but from earlier Brahmanic or Shamanic schools. Thus, in the last 40 years, most of those who have tried to better define the Buddhist term dhyāna have referred, admittedly, to both Upanishadic and epic Sanskrit sources, whose compositions were certainly contemporary with Buddhism itself. So it is with the Chandogya Upanishad where the term appears for the first time, the Katha Upanishad, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and even in the Shamanic domain, the Tattvartha Sutra China. Moreover, from the point of view of the ancient history of Buddhist doctrine, it is still necessary to grasp what the purpose of such a 4 degrees psychosomatic practice might have been. Even though Buddhist emancipation was fundamentally based on knowledge, vidya, that of the 4 noble truths, Chatur Arya Satya, and that the Eightfold Path, Ashtanga Marga, leaves no room for dhyāna, but for samadhi, samyak samadhi alone. And that the first code of the law of conditioned production, pratitya samutpada, also comes under the heading of non-knowledge or ignorance, avidya. The absence of the term dhyāna in the most ancient elements of the Buddhist Dharma, which is common to all the ancient schools, even led Emile Sénard to state, with regard that this ecstatic concentration practiced by Siddhartha Gautama before his awakening body, that, I quote, this theory does not belong to Buddhism in its own right any more than does the legendary adventure Crohn's, and to conclude radically that, I quote, it is from yoga that Buddhism received the 4 contemplations of dhyāna. After briefly touching on of Buddhist hagiographic sources, we propose firstly to return to the term dhyāna by seeking its pre-Buddhist roots, particularly Rigvedic, then, secondly, accordingly, to define its function in the construction of the founding figure of the Buddha. Thus, we will not discuss here the actual nature of the 4 degrees of dhyāna, nor the complex history of their elaboration. Our purpose will be rather to understand the necessary passage through the practice of dhyāna in traditional biographies of the founder of Buddhism by Buddhist hagiographers in 2 major episodes: the attainment of enlightenment body and the attainment of complete extinction parinirvana. This research is a continuation of my research already carried out of the Vedic common background, which has been used over the centuries to construct the figure of the founder of Buddhism. If his life as a prince setting out to conquer immortality was built on the model of the Vedic god Indra, from his birth through the right side of his mother as a new Indra, the moment of awakening, i.e. the image of Shakyamuni seated under a tree, perpetuates the celestial Atharvavedic cosmological representation referring to the divine world and immortality, Amrita. The term dhyāna, in the 4 degrees of dhyāna enumeration, Shatpari Dhyānani, or indeed in detailed description of them, appears regularly in both canonical and extra-canonical Buddhist textual sources. Throughout the Buddhist literature of the ancient schools and Mahayana, both in Prakrit and Sanskrit, the convergence of terms used to describe the 4 degrees or anga of the dhyana is remarkable, and not only attests to the work of establishing these technical terms at the date which it is nevertheless difficult to determine, but also reflects a concern for doctrinal unity around this practice, which in the economy of the biographical episodes of the founder's life was considered to be a prerequisite to his attaining of awakening or body. This is the main episode in which the 4 degrees of dhyana appear. In his research on the history of writing about the life of the founder of Buddhism, André Barrault expressed this apparent necessity as follows, I quote, "In the minds of the ancient narrators, the 3 sciences that constitute enlightenment could only have appeared in a particular psychic state characterized by intense concentration, great stability, and the absence of any disturbing element, and this state could only have been attained by the 4 meditations." The practice of dhyana was also mentioned when the young Siddhartha Gautama experienced impermanence, notably when he visited the farming fields with his father. A reconstruction of the compositional history of this episode showed that while originally there was no mention of either the farm field or dhyana in this first experience of impermanence, as attested in the version of the Sukhamala Sutta, the revisers inserted the 1st degree of dhyana, as indicated in the Chinese translation of the same sutta made by Gautama Sangadeva in 398 ED, from a Kashmirian version of the Sarvastivadin school. Similarly, the Mahasandika authors of the Mahavasthu made mention of the 1st degree of dhyana immediately after the young Siddhartha became aware of impermanence when he saw a child carrying away a frog to eat and rejecting a snake that the peasant spiders had unearthed. But the Buddhist hagiographers did not leave it at that, and just as their predecessors had inserted the 1st degree of dhyana, some like the reviser of the Lalita Vistara in the 5th century AD, hardly hesitated to include in this episode not only the 1st degree of the Mahayanist authors of the Lalita Vistara had done in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, a reading confirmed by the Chinese translation of Dharmaraksha made in 308, but the entire description of the 4 degrees of dhyana in the prosaic part equal to that preceding the attainment of enlightenment and the mention of the 4 degrees in the versified part. Moreover, the authors of the Milinda Pancha went so far as to specify that the future Buddha was then only 1 month old when, I quote, sitting cross-legged in his august cradle in the cool shade of an apple tree, he isolated himself from sensual pleasures and harmful things, and then successively entered in the 4 degrees of jhana. Be that as it may, the study of the construction of this episode of the Buddha's traditional life, placed after his marriage in the Buddha Charita of Ashvaghosha, 2nd century AD, and not during his childhood, allows us to grasp how the hagiographers gradually incorporated the 1st degree of dhyana in order to be able to justify its experience by Sakyamuni at the time when the latter became aware of the inanity of the Astanaka dhyana he practiced for 6 years and decided to abandon this difficult ascetic practice and return to the dhyana practice of his youth, which, as a result of the 4 degrees, led him to enlightenment. Finally, the 3rd episode in the Buddha's life, which mentions the 4 degrees of jhana, concerns the entry into complete extinction or parinirvana. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta of the Theravadin school, as well as in the Mahaparinirvana Sutta of the Mulasarvastivadin school, and in a more condensed way in the Buddha Charita of Ashvaghosha, it is recounted how the Buddha passed from the 1st to the 4th degrees of dhyana, how then passed through the 4 states of consciousness proper to samapati, and then how, in reverse order, he passed from the 4th state of samapati to the 1st, and from the 4th degree of dhyana to the 1st, and finally, again, passed from the 1st degree of dhyana to the 4th before passing away completely. What we should pay attention to here is the fact that the Buddha reached complete extinction only after entering the 4th degree of jhana, and not after reaching the 4th state of samapati proper to the formless plane of Arupadhatu. What is more, where the Theravadin school represented the end of the Buddha's life by saying, I quote, having left the 4th jhana immediately, the Blessed One became completely extinct. The Mulasarvastivadin school gave a slightly longer version in which the use of the possessive adjective kakshusman is by no means negligible. I quote, after attaining the 4th dhyana, he, the awakening one who gifted with vision, that is the possessive adjective kakshusman, has entered into unchanging stillness. He, the Blessed One, became completely extended. Apart from the episode relating to the youth of Siddhartha Gautama, in which the mention of dhyana was made after the fact, it is well known that the episodes recounting the attainment of enlightenment body and the entry into complete extension, parinirvana, indicate that the later 2 states were attained only after having reached precisely the 4th degree of dhyana, and not after having abided in the correct samadhi or samyak samadhi, such as bhikshu are required to practice according to the 8-fold path, and which has 4 attainments, namely the 4 planes, ayatana, of spatial infinity, of non-existence of what is, of cognitive infinity, and of non-consciousness and non-awareness, which correspond, cosmologically speaking, to the formless plane of Arupadhatu preceding extinction or nirvana. The second and fourth samapati falling respectively within the purpose of the teaching of Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputra that Shakyamuni followed prior to his 6 years of ascetic practice. However, according to Buddhist sources, the Buddha did not pass away in this fourth and final state of consciousness prepared to samadhi and arupadhatu, but rather he had attained and then emerged from the fourth degree of dhyāna, which was correlated with the plane of form of rupadhatu, which is closer or less refined than that of arupadhatu. The complex history of the very content of the Samyak Samadhi, consisting of the 4 degrees of dhyāna and the 4 ayatana, originating, according to the Brahmajala Sutta, as much from Brahmanic as Shramanic circles, and always linked to the question of the Atman, to which was added in the 9th and the last place, the Nirodha Samapati, in the result of a long elaboration in Buddhist intellectual circles of this state of concentration or samadhi, and cannot therefore be traced back to the teaching of the historical Buddha. Now, to understand this conception of a sine qua non passage through the practice of dhyāna for the attainment of body and subsequently entry into the parinirvana, it is necessary to take into consideration the historical links between the Pili and the Buddhist traditions. Unlike the masculine term samadhi, which is constructed from the verbal root da and denotes the act of fixing thought, the neuter known dhyāna, on the other hand, is composed of the verbal root dhya, the development of the Rigvedic root di, to think, to which is attached the suffix na, used to construct abstract nouns. Thus, to the neutral nominal formation of samadhana, the fixation of thought to the object of thought, corresponds the form dhyāna, which conceptualizes a type of thinking action and thus characterize that what the feminine noun dhya designated as early as the Rig Veda, thinking, and more particularly reflective thinking. Nevertheless, the noun dhyana appears later in Vedic literature, notably for the first time in the Chandogya Upanishad. It is present in an enumeration of about 15 terms and holds the 5th rank between thought, chitta, and understanding, vijnana. The context of this Upanishad, belonging to the Samaveda school, is interesting as it is a teaching professed by the Kshatriya, Sanat Kumara, or Skanda, to the Brahman Narada. The latter asks him about the Atman Brahman, the knowledge of which, and better still the vision of which, enables one to cross the sufferings, shoka, and thus reach the other shore. Dhyana is here to be understood as reflective thought proper to men who aim to attain moral greatness, mahatma, as opposite to vile beings, alpha. But at no point it is a practice similar to that of the 4 Buddhist degrees. At most, according to the stereotypal formula recurring throughout this 15-term enumeration, I quote, "He who holds reflective thought to be Brahman in the realm of reflective thought, he can do anything he wants." And finally, I quote, "He who sees that, sees neither death, nor sickness, nor suffering. He who sees thus, sees anything, everywhere, he attains everything." Also, these terms, as well as the law of enunciation, chronologically precede by a short time or are contemporaneous with the recurrent Buddhist formula of old age, sickness, death. The path leading to the removal of suffering and the law of conditioned production. The fact remains that the Upanishadic term dhyāna cannot be easily reconciled with the Buddhist one. The primary idea of the Buddhist dhyāna must be thought elsewhere than in the Samaveda school, for it does seem that the latter had already made the term dhyāna its own, which it introduced in a hierarchical enumeration of concepts. The description of the preparation for enlightenment in the traditional biographies of the Buddha, namely the placing of a litter of auspicious herbs, pusha or darba, the purification by ablution in the river Nairanjana, the covering of a new garment, the triple circumambulation around the right side of the tree, the sitting cross-legged with the face turned towards the east, the world of the Deva, constitutes the individual practice described in the Aranyaka, which itself originates in the setting up of the sacrificial area and the preparatory phase of purification, diksha, through which every sacrificer, yajamana, must pass according to the ritualistic schools of the Vedic period. It is therefore appropriate, as far as the Buddhist practice of dhyāna is concerned, not to wait to find this known as it is in the Vedic literature, but to take into consideration the verbal root dhyāna from which this abstract has been forged. Also, the Rig Veda offers a set of occurrences that allows us to better grasp the Indo-Arya conception of thought and the role it had to play in the relationship between human beings and the invisible world, i.e., escaping the organ of sight. Among the occurrences of the verbal root di and d, the present participle dhyāna shows that, as early as in the hymns belonging to the so-called family books, the ordinary man, Nara, sings from the organ of sight, Nara's Chakshusa Dhyāna, i.e., it takes into consideration only what he sees through his eyes. It is quite different from the ancient sages, the ancient rishi, who, in contrast, had once thought within themselves, Pratnasa Rishayo Dhyāna, using reflective thought, and had thus found or become aware of the light shining in the distance. It was by thinking through true or sincere reflex thought that they conveyed the chariot of Indra and Vayu, or as the ritual formulae, Yajus, were found. As Yangonda demonstrated perfectly in his 1963 book, The Vision of Vedic Poets, the Rig Vedic roots, D and Di, refer to the idea of seeing by thought, of obtaining vision in thought, of that which cannot be perceived by the organ of sight. If the insightful Ribu gods had, prior to the making of the three-world cosmic chariot, a thought vision of it emanating from their own minds, the seven primitive rishi, in the other hand, show in thought the divine law, Rata, at the origin of the cosmic order, Rita, and became its guardians, Ratapa. In the Rig Vedic tradition, this ability to see through thought is specific to the rishi, an Indo-Iranian term which, on the Indian side, designates one who goes through the mind from the world of humans to the world of the gods and who sees the correlations between these two worlds. Another known equivalent to Diya is Diditi, the vision obtained through thought. In Vedic ritualistic circles, the ingested juice of the pressed somic plant sets in motion or stimulates the vision of the cosmic order or Rita, according to the recurring formula Hinvan Ritasya Diditi. The very idea of perceiving by thought what the physical eyes cannot see led Vedic lexicographers to draw a linguistic parallel between the term rishi and the verbal root rish, to see, as evident in the 6th century BC, Yaska in his Nirukta, by taking up the statement of the grammarian Aupamanyava, I quote, "The term rishi comes from vision, for according to Aupamanyava, he, the rishi, saw the ease." Thus, the rishi, and especially the ancient rishi, were regarded in the Vedic and then the Brahmanic tradition as seers, beings who had seen within themselves by their reflective thinking not only what would take shape by the spoken word, e.a. the Vedic Sukta Rigvedic, but also what the later would materialize in the human world, namely the knowledge of the ordering Rita, of the constituent elements of the universe. Thus, they obtain the sacred knowledge, Veda, of the role to be played by every human being in this cosmic order established by the Deva, the gods, and of his post-mortem becoming according to his pious observances accomplished during his earthly life. The uses of the verbal forms di and dii, as well as the present participle dhyāna, are thus present as much in the so-called family book, the most archaic, as in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, the most recent compositional book of the hymnal. This Rigvedic concept of obtaining a vision of the Rita or the Vrata through reflective thought became a traditional topos thereafter in the Vedic literature. Among the many occurrences to our West mentioning in a hymn in the Atharva Veda relating to a funeral rite, the poet specifies the post-mortem fate of the unmarried who had no offspring and who could therefore not be recipients of sacrifice to the deceased or Pitriyajna. Nevertheless, because they depart, pareyu, having attained tranquility and having abandoned all aversion, having ascended to heaven, they find a place in it, and there, on the back of the celestial vault, they remain immersed in their reflective thought. This idea that a solitary being, probably an ascetic who had devoted his life to the study of Brahman or Brahmachari, who has attained inner peace through the abandonment of all hatred, while reside after his death in a celestial world where he will remain immersed in a state of reflection or contemplation. He is not unlike what the Buddhist schools would develop a few centuries later in their meditative cosmology relating to the bhikshu who, after having attained one or another of the 4 degrees of dhyāna, will reach after their death, respectively, the worlds of the Brahmakayika, the Abhadeva, the Shubhadeva, or that of the Briyatpala, and will remain in this world of the plane of forms Upadatu, immersed as they will be in the corresponding degree of dhyāna. The second occurrence concerns the connection between the term rishi and that of shramana, as the latter appears for the first time in Taittiriya Aranyaka of the Brahmanic ritualistic school of the Black Yajurveda. This known shramana was subsequently used extensively until it became a separate category of ascetics that divided the religious landscape of ancient India into Brahmana and Shramana, and to which the bhikshu of the Buddhist Sangha became attached. In the traditional myth or story of how ritualistic rishis succeeded in obtaining from mainland Rishi Sukta or 4 purging stanzas, the author describes this mainland rishi as windbelt, i.e. living naked, and shramana, ascetic, insertion makers. Now, while the rishi ritualistic, through their faith, shraddha, and ascetic warm-up, tapas, managed to find this rishi shramana who had hidden themselves, they eventually obtained the purifying stanza from them and had knowledge of them after having the vision, etani suktani apasyan, a faculty peculiar to the rishi, according to the Rigvedic tradition. This implies that for the brahmanas of the Taittiriya school, the shramana were indeed rishi, who had had the ability to see the purifying sukta long before the ritualistic rishi, who eventually in turn also had the vision. What then of the Buddha, the one whom his disciples called, according to the sutra and the Vinaya, certainly the shramana or mahashramana, but also the rishi or the maharshi, the great rishi, on a par with the maharshi cited in Atharva Veda and referring to the 7 primitive rishi who echo the Buddhas of the past. In his research on the biography of the Buddha, Barrow noted the convergence between the ancient schools, Theravada, Sarvastivada, Dharmaguptaka, and Mahishasaka, to which we can still add that of the Mahasangika concerning the passage through the 4 degrees of dhyana before attaining awakening body, a passage also preserved subsequently in the writings of the Mahayana. However, it did not explain it, I quote. The monks of the 1st and 2nd centuries after the parinirvana may have had other and better reasons than we do for thinking that the Bodhisattva had used the 4 meditation to prepare for the appearance of the awakening. Reasons of which time has preserved no trace, or which have become so mixed up with later doctrinal elements that we can no longer distinguish them clearly. Beyond the detailed description of the 4 degrees, which is a doctrinal construction, as shown by the parallelism to the first 2 degrees, the reference in the 3rd to the knowledge of the Arya, i.e. either the pre-Buddhist honorable masters or the first ascetic disciples of the founder, as suggested by the ancient Buddhist teaching of the Arya, as in the Minor Rock Edict of the King Ashoka, and then in the Arya Vansha Sutta, but not with the term dhyana, but bhavana. And finally, the overcoming of opposites in the 4th degree, which echoed that already taught by Yajnavalkya, as or 7th century BC and preserved in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Buddhist tradition relating the Buddha's awakening drew in the Vedic tradition of the rishis sage who, through true or purified thought, obtained a clear vision of the Rita. Indeed, the Buddhist hagiographers, some of whom had received a Vedic education before their conversion, could hardly fail to describe the attainment of enlightenment, and thus the vision of the threefold knowledge, Vidya, which is opposed to the threefold Brahmanic knowledge, Vidya, without reference not only to the material preparation of the sacredness of the place where Shakyamuni sat, according to the Vedic tradition peculiar to the Aranyakayana, but also to the ancient rishi who had seen through thought the means of attaining Amrita or endless through the sacrificial act. If the 4 degrees of dhyāna appear in the Buddhist tradition as the indispensable mental preparation through which Shakyamuni had to pass in order to obtain the threefold knowledge, the Buddhist concept of dhyāna, on the other hand, had probably had to refer from its first use not to a practice of concentration, but to the thought vision of a new Rita, a new law or doctrine, Dharma, the understanding of which opened the way to the attainment of emancipation, vimukti, and thus to the stopping of any process of a new existence, punarbhava. The final formulation, excluding any new existence, called, is strongly reminiscent of the Vedic era Brahmanic ritualistic schools, repelling any new death, punarmrityu. The Buddhist tradition thus developed a whole lexical field around this old Vedic concept of seeing by thought, by enumerating from the 2 basic Vedic visions, one human, mensa chakshus, the other divine, divya chakshus, 5 kinds of sight, pancha chakshus. In both complete and incomplete traditional biographies of the Buddha, the experience of enlightenment body has always been emphasized by Buddhist hagiographers as a central event that divides Shakyamuni's life into 2 distinct times. The time before enlightenment, during which the young prince Siddhartha Gautama then saw by the organ of sight and made the observation of the impermanence of all things and suffering by observing in the farming field, for example, animals and the hard work of the laborers, or later, by examining the bodies of a sick person, of an old man, and a dead man during 3 successive outings from the royal palace, and the time after awakening, conditioned by dhyāna, which enabled him to see by thought and acquire reflective vision, darshana, and what the Buddhist tradition then called the eye of the awakening one, or Buddha chakshus. At a time far removed from the Vedic period, the author of the Lalita Vistara found himself obliged to specify the suitable means by which the Bodhisattva came in the 4th degree of dhyāna to obtain the vision, darshana, of knowledge. This was he indicated through the divine of celestial view, dhyāna chakshusa, perfectly pure and, above all, far surpassing the physical view, atikranta manushya tena. In the eyes of his disciples, Shakyamuni, as the enlightened one, Buddha, could not have been an ordinary man, Nara, whose thinking remains under the yoke of the organ of sight, but rather an exceptional being who had, through visionary thought, dhyāna, the knowledge of the true order, Saddharma, the new order of Rita, which then enable him to establish the appropriate means to stop the cycle of the transmigration, samsara, and thus the suffering, dukkha, of living beings, an anthropological dichotomy marking a clear distinction between the common man and the rishi, taking up an old tradition dating back to the Rigveda poets. This is why Burnou's choice of the French term contemplation, according to its Latin etymology, was entirely correct. While the practice of dhyāna had been regarded as a preliminary preparation for enlightenment, it was also subsequently regarded as a psychosomatic method through which the Buddha passed in order to enter into complete extinction, nirvana, thus taking up the long Vedic tradition that the ancient rishi, having entered into themselves, saw the Rita by thought. The proponents of the Buddhist tradition, who modeled this pre-Buddhist conception on the Buddha, finally came to believe that the practice of dhyāna, which they developed and gradually into 4 degrees, could lead any bhikshu during his lifetime to obtain the vision of the nirvana itself. Thus, according to the sutta, the Buddha explained to the Brahman that without this noble vision, the latter could neither experience the absence of disease nor see extinction or nirvana. Such a conception of a mental state that would enable one to attain the vision not of the Dharma, but of the nirvana, prefiguring post-mortem extinction, applied to the life of the Buddha, itself constructed from the Rigvedic prototype of the ancient rishi as an ideal typical model to be followed and imitated by members of the Sangha, had consequences for the history of Buddhism. On the one hand, it distanced the bhikshu from the austere practices of the most rigorous asceticism, notably the Aranyaka dhyāna, one of the 2 extreme proscribed paths, and on the other hand, it ended up developing in parallel with and even in competition with the gaining of knowledge, vidya, of the fundamentally outlined Buddhist doctrine, a vast current in India itself and then outside of bhikshu who devoted themselves to the exclusive practice of dhyāna, chan, or zen, and the history of Mahayana Buddhism, and then that of Chinese and Japanese Buddhism shows us that some Buddhist monks, having failed to attain Bodhi through the practice of dhyāna, and having been disappointed by this failure, sought other ways to attain it. They indirectly confirm the history of the construction of the Buddha figure from Vedic symbolic elements that were not originally part of a psychosomatic practice. This is certainly the case with the early Buddhist concept of dhyāna. ご清聴ありがとうございました。